take over as vice chairman and go through adjournment.
Yeah? Go straight to adjournment?
We're gonna wait for you for the next meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did this.
This is unusual. We're usually more late ones.
I know, well, it was only a minute.
No, I meant because we're usually late.
I know you guys are all sitting here.
Weird.
So I think we're up to infrastructure and land use implementation programs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, land use 2A, airport.
I have a note on that, in that it seems to me that when you initially, all the land use designations surrounding the airport need to be found compatible with the airport land use compatibility plan, okay? Now, this calls for that to be reviewed every 5 years, but it seems to me the 5-year component is not necessary because every time you contemplate or propose a change in land use designations surrounding the airport, you are necessarily looking at that proposed change in light of the airport land use compatibility plan. So you're doing this job on an ongoing basis. I don't know that we need to stop and look at it again every 5 years, because with respect to any changes that you've made, it would be too late.
Right. I would concur with that.
So then if we were just to change it to say on an ongoing basis, review land use designations, review proposed land use designations surrounding the airport, and then surrounding the airport for consistency with the airport land use compatibility plan. Okay,
Works?
so that, and necessarily, they will be reviewed in the process of completing the general plan.
Right. I'm not sure where that 5-year language came from. I'm not aware of anything that mandates that we look at it. You know, I think we need to ensure that when the land use compatibility plan is updated, that the state law requires that we bring the general plan into conformance with the land use compatibility plan, not the other way around, which I
Right.
find a little strange.
Right.
But that's the way the law is written. So if there's an update to that plan, then we need to review our general plan to make sure that it's consistent. And so this would,
Case by case, ongoing
Yeah.
basis. Right.
and then any proposed changes around the airport, we would need to make sure it's consistent. So I think
That's
that
it.
works.
That's it. I think the only time that you would review the airport land use compatibility plan would be if the state says, we got new guidelines for airport compatibility plans.
Or if they extend the runway or something like that.
Yeah, if there are changes to the airport that require a change in the plan.
Yeah. That's
I
already
believe
written
it's I'm not sure who is the, it's called the Local Airport Land Use Commission, which is an entity that creates the plan, and I'm not sure what that entity is here in Calaveras County. It may be the COG, it may be a separate entity, and I'm not sure what time frame they have. You know, is there a mandate, like in the state law, the housing element has to be updated every certain period of time? I'm not sure what that is. But yeah, we certainly would have to review it pursuant to state law at that time, or as Ted suggests, any changes in the airport that might necessitate a change to the plan.
I accept that.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yeah.
Okay. Solid waste and liquid waste facilities, B2. We're good? Mm-hmm. Okay. 2C, coordination with special districts and agencies.
Now, that's a new piece that you added since the beginning of the year, correct, Mr. Mauer?
Yes.
The only thing I would say, just I think sounds better, is new development shall be required to build or pay the proportional amount to construct the necessary facilities.
Just so you don't use build twice in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Should it say new or expanding?
Expanding where?
If someone is expanding a development versus new?
I think that would be considered.
Yeah, I
new.
think that would be
Okay.
considered new, yeah.
Then I'm good.
Okay, we're good with that. We're going to community character and design. 3A, community design guidelines.
I've got questions with respect to the 1G, which was moved to this section. 1G that used to be under land use patterns is now, let's see, what is it? It's, this is the buffers. I saw it a moment ago, now where is it? It's now
Compatible land uses,
3J.
3J, yes.
Okay, so 3A and 3J, what was my problem with that? My question is 3A for communities only, and 3J is for areas outside of existing communities? That's my question. Is that a valid question?
I think, yes. So the intent of 3A is that where there are communities that want to create specific design guidelines, and this would probably be more along the lines of architectural standards, that through the adoption process of the board, sort of initiated by community members, through maybe that, I don't know how it actually would happen, but the Colony Hill, for example, has a set of design guidelines that was somewhat promulgated by the community, adopted by the county. So if another community, Arnold, wanted to do the same thing, they would sort of petition the board in one way or another. The board would say, yeah, that's a good idea. Staff work with the community to develop guidelines.
I might just add that.
3J, oh, go ahead.
Just in McCallum Hill's example, which I would imagine it would be the same, as there's another layer in there, in that it was developed by community members, but it was also presented to the community at various town hall meetings and through the participation of, I would say, probably most of the property owners that would be affected by those guidelines.
Yeah, there would be a process in which the
Yes.
community would be
Yes.
involved in developing those. Not something the county would impose necessarily on them.
Or initiate.
But the community initiated, the community developed what they felt was appropriate.
Why
3J is more of standards that might be in the zoning code, for example, that says if you're putting a commercial development next to an existing residential use, there would be landscaping or buffering or something that would be developed to limit the incompatibility between those uses. Would not necessarily be like design standards. They'd be more development standards.
Okay, but then within, if 3J overlaps with a community as identified in 3A, if the community has a design standard, that 3J is incompatible with, then what? I'll give you an example. If you've got a historic community, things like berms and the like, that's kind of a modern design element.
Right.
Didn't exist back when these historic communities were developed. So now if we've got these kinds of design standards that include berms and building setbacks, which that is another modern modern design feature, that's very incompatible with a historic community design.
We would certainly have to look at language in those standards to identify sort of which takes precedent. And I would think that the community design standards would take precedent over more generalized
Yeah, I think that gets to my issue, because that's why I thought perhaps one is directed toward a community, and the other is everything outside of communities, established communities. The 3J
Or it might be
factor.
where there's established community, but where they haven't adopted guidelines.
Okay,
So I think those are the kind of issues that you would work out as you're developing that language, that ordinance. It doesn't have to be stated in here. But you would need to ensure that when you're adopting those kinds of standards, that we don't have internal conflicts.
okay, I get that, I accept that. Now, in 3A, the language, assist a community which requests and receives board supervision, go ahead and work with that community, whereas that language has now been crossed out. So now we're jumping into adopting community design guidelines or standards for communities identified by the Board of Supervisors. Identified how? Because they requested it? That's my.
Yeah, the reason I took that language out was, how does a community request something? I mean,
Well, I have that issue as well.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately it's the board's decision, and it's going to come from a desire by members of the community, whoever they are, and then in a public hearing, there's going to be some say, we want design guidelines, there's going to be other people say, we don't want, any more restrictions than we've already got, and the board will decide, yes, it's appropriate to develop design guidelines for this community, or it's not. How it gets to that point, I don't think really matters. There's probably any number of avenues that could precipitate a desire or lack of desire to create design guidelines for a community. And
Okay,
rather
so
than get so specific here, it's just like, ultimately it's the board's decision, so let's just start there.
It's the board's decision to do it or not do it.
Right.
And in the process of making that decision, they are deciding, does the community really want this, or is this a half a dozen people?
Correct.
That's
Yeah.
only, and everybody else is
Right.
either indifferent or opposed to
And
it.
then as we look at the prioritization of all these things, if the board says we don't, there's no demand from the community for this, it's not going to be on our list of things to do. We're looking at the other things that need to get done where there is a demand from the community, or because of state law we have to do it. Those would be our high priorities. But as a community steps forward and says, we really want and need some type of standards for our community, that raises the level to a higher priority.
Okay, then my final question is, would 3A, in your opinion, need language to the effect? Because this says you're going to do something, and you might not necessarily do it. There are factors that affect the go, no-go decision that aren't identified in here. Not that you would identify every one, but does this component need that language that identifies this as a possibility, not a necessity?
I think that's a good point. I'm trying to think what kind of language we could plug in there that would provide that
Well,
sort
it
of
might be,
optional element to this.
it could be just simply at the outset, where appropriate, adopt community design guidelines. And then the where appropriate becomes that body of decision-making, those factors. Where appropriate, if only a few people want it and everybody else doesn't, then it's inappropriate. If it, maybe a number of things. Something
I think that-
that the board can point to and say, we don't think it's appropriate, or we do think it's appropriate, and here we go. I think I'm done with that one.
Or, I don't know about where appropriate.
Where-
I'm struggling with
where
Yeah.
desired?
Or just where requested. I mean, because then why would it be inappropriate,
But we get back to who's doing the
Well, but
requesting.
that's,
If
the
one
requesting
person
alone
requests it-
doesn't make it appropriate. That would be a factor. Why would the board jump in and decide for a community that it's going to do something the community has never said, we want it? So the where appropriate takes everything into consideration. Was it prompted by community desires? Was it prompted by genuine community desires, a consensus of opinion, et cetera, et cetera? I think a request would be kind of a necessity, because otherwise the board is being
How, because that first sentence on there, assist a community which requests and receives Board of Supervisors authorization, what if we left that sentence in there and took out the assist a community and made it, if a community which requests and receives board approval, where appropriate doesn't sound right.
I just threw that out there. It was, I'm just trying to come up with
You brought up a good point.
some phrase that allows for the board to decide under what conditions that deems a change, deems a community design guideline appropriate
Yeah.
or not to
About-
develop.
Where desired by the community?
No, because, I don't think so, because then you're left with, how do you measure that? How do you gauge whether that's
Right.
true? And even if it's desired by the community, there may be some valid reason why the board says, that's a lousy idea. No, we're not going to do it for some other reason. There might be some valid reason why the board tells a community that otherwise wants it.
Okay, so
I'm
wait a minute.
sorry, we
I
can't
think
give you
the
that.
language is already here. If you read the second sentence that was added, adopt community design guidelines or standards for communities identified by the Board of Supervisors. Doesn't that really take care of it?
Well, that's what I was hoping to, but I'm not sure I got there.
I think you got there.
Well, it really works for me because they're going to identify one after they've gone through the process of
Yeah.
saying, we want one, we have enough people, we've had a town hall meeting, so the board's like, well, all right.
So once the
how
Board
did
of
you do it in
Supervisors
Montreal?
have identified it and.
Well, that's how we did it in Moke Hill, is that
Yeah.
we was local people that, we've had one for like 20 years. We
Yeah.
just re-upped it.
So I don't know if Arnold still is.
No,
They
we're
had
the-
Design review committee.
We're
for
the
years.
only
No,
one
we
in
ended
the,
up with planned
in
development
the
instead.
county.
Yeah.
Well, and we ended up with both.
Yeah, well, you can have our.
Double
PD.
whammy. So, I think it's fine the way it is. I
I
think
do
it's
too.
clear enough.
When you read that second line that's been added, does that give you better clarification there?
Where did you add it? What did you add?
I didn't, Peter did, and I think if you read it all the way through, it makes sense. Adopt community design guidelines or standards for communities identified by the Board of Supervisors.
Oh, identified becomes the qualifier?
Yes,
Yes.
instead of where appropriate. Once they've been identified, then we move it forward. I
So, I
think
mean,
Peter covered it.
question is, they could never identify one, and that's cool, too.
Right. They
So
would
it-
have
it-
to be
I don't think it's
identified for that to
mandatory.
apply.
I suppose they could tentatively identify one and then decide it's not appropriate,
That
and
they could.
unidentify it.
Correct,
They could-
see? Just put the "un" in front of it. We'll undo it.
For this.
Okay.
All right?
you.
All right. Lighting and glare.
Well, this is where I have my first issue that we've discussed at great length. A dark sky ordinance may very well be a good idea. It would save the planning department from having to come up with conditions applicable to individual projects, because it would all be in one ordinance. But my issue is, as discussed at length, what happens if you don't do it and a project gets sidetracked or jeopardized because of that failure? And you can adopt the ordinance whether or not this general plan requires the county to do it or not.
So Kelly, would I'm imagining you're having the same issue with the hillside development and the landscaping
In the parking and the signage.
and the parking and the signage. So, and I think we've heard a lot of discussion about what your concerns are. I don't think we have to like rehash those, kind of go into those in depth. So maybe we could just, or some of the other commissioners, if you have any other additional comments or concerns, or if there's, specific edits, because Kelly's asking for a wholesale removal of those particular
So you're looking at removing 3B,
3B,
3C.
3D, 3G, and 3H.
3G and 3H.
Right.
Okay.
So if we can kind of like get right down to the nuts and bolts of it, and so Kelly's suggesting removal of those, maybe we can hear from the other commissioners?
Well, there's already an ordinance on the hillside development, which is the 4290 I spoke about earlier regarding slope.
Well, that has to do with driveway steepness.
Right.
not necessarily.
It doesn't have to do with building on the top of a hill.
That's
That has to do with,
more narrowly focused as far as design standards for driveways, the 16% or 21% slope requirement of CAL FIRE,
that Lisa was mentioning.
that Lisa mentioned
Yeah.
in the previous item.
Well, if we're going into the specifics, like of 3C hillside management, are there standards in place now that address these slope-related densities and grading and so forth?
No.
We don't have an ordinance on that at all?
But are there,
There are design standards. You can't build a driveway a certain steepness, but that doesn't prevent someone from doing a switchback up a mountainside. You have to engineer a house if it's on a steep slope so it doesn't slide down the mountain, but there's nothing that, sort of limits the extent of development on steep.
There's nothing that says you can't cut and fill if you can afford it.
Right,
the money.
right. I mean, the San Francisco example, you can build anything anywhere. Is that what we want in Calaveras County? And the development of an ordinance would sort of say, okay, we want to put some limitations, or we don't, on how much density, what type of standard we have for hillside development.
So most of these things that we're looking at here on these items, the 5 that he's picked out of here, seem to be related to community plans that would have addressed all of these issues.
Well, only to the, no, I don't think so.
I don't either.
No, it
No.
was mostly in the one in District 3, the signage, the parking, these things were addressed in most of those. Not the hillside development, but we did have a community portion on the light and glare and the landscaping. So your community plans don't address these types of issues?
I don't know, I haven't seen it yet.
You haven't seen your community plan?
No, the existing one?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think we have anything about light and glare. I don't think there's anything about hillside development. I don't believe there's anything about landscaping in the current community plan. I think parking, it might say that the county should ease up on the parking restrictions. And no, I don't believe there's anything about signage in the existing community plan.
Well, we're kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but I had a comment about your, the hillside development aspect. I'm going to comment on the whole ball of wax here in a few minutes, but on this one, we talked about the fact that the only thing that exists right now is a driveway angle, right? And as Mr. Maurer pointed out, okay, if you exceed this, what is it, 21%?
16.
16 or whatever it is, then your only option is to go back and forth, do a switchback kind of a thing. And if the property doesn't allow you to do that, you simply can't build there. So the hillside management kind of takes care of itself in that sense. The density takes care of itself, because to build on that hillside with the driveway restriction, you have to have a certain amount of land to make an appropriate driveway, and that affects your density automatically. As far as the dwelling itself, sliding down the hill, are there not building codes for hillside development that require extra one thing or another, drainage factors, foundation issues, that address that component?
So,
Well,
I'm not a building guy either,
yeah,
but
the building code and, design requirements for home construction is to ensure that wherever you put it, it's going to be safe. So there's soil compaction requirements, there's engineering requirements. It doesn't address whether or not it's a good idea to put the house in that location versus some other location. So the measure, the program is intended to implement policy 4.1, which says new development shall be designed to be compatible with the natural, scenic, and historic resources of Calaveras County. It's one of the measures used to implement that. So it's the part that says, how does this new development fit in more with the natural and scenic character of the county? And typically, counties such as ours would say, okay, we want to actually establish a limitation, not based on how much you can engineer it, because you can engineer pretty much anything. You could put, 6-story condos on steep hillsides, if that's what we wanted to. I mean, yeah, the market's going to regulate that to some degree, but we say, if you have a slope that's more than 30%, maybe there is a minimum parcel size, regardless of how you might be able to engineer the design on it.
Don't you think that that's pretty restrictive and that each individual one should be looked at? I mean, I don't know how you do a one rule fits all, because every situation is going to be completely unique. And if you put in a hillside development restriction on that, looking at one certain parcel, it may not even apply to the other one, because it could be that parcels are going to be different sizes, they're going to be in different areas, they're going to be next to communities, not next to communities. I don't know how you can adopt a one-size-fits-all and how you would ever be able to come up with an ordinance that would be a one-size-fits-all. I mean, I
Well,
think,
the ordinance would be designed to apply to the specifics of that site. And, so if you're looking at a subdivision that has, varying topography, you say, okay, here's where you can put the smaller lots. Because of the steepness, this needs to be larger lots over here. There may be, you could have a maximum slope, and you say, no, we just don't want to see building on that slope because of the amount of cut and fill that would be necessary to make it work, or the potential for erosion hazard. There's any number of reasons we might want to do that.
Okay, but there you get to it. We already have the driveway thing, okay? If we had cut and fill limitations, maybe we already do, I don't know. But I agree with Lisa that it's putting a limitation that I think the parcel itself is going to determine its own limitations. And I don't think the county, I have a problem with the statement that we should decide what it is or is not a good idea, quote unquote.
It's simply a policy call.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, now are we protecting hillsides? Where we were protecting resource production, and we're protecting open space, and we're protecting vistas, and enough protection is enough already, I think. Why do all these things need protecting?
well, I can think of one reason, only because we've been hit with a crisis that we regret and wish we never had. But now that we're looking at those areas that are impacted by the fire, and we're looking at mudslide areas and potentials for things, we don't see those things into our future, but if those hillsides are the things we're worried about the most today, and we've let people build on those in the past, and now we may be having to tell them that we're sorry, you're never going to be able to build there again. So if we said, it's got some trickery to it, because I don't want to tell someone they can't build on their land, but I also don't want to let them build on something and then their entire future is lost, because we allowed an unsafe condition to happen to begin with. I mean, we may never see another fire in our lifetime, but then again, we
That's right.
might.
Yeah.
Well, to a great extent, one can make the case that the extent of the fire and the ferocity of the fire and the damage of the fire was due to somebody saying we need to protect something. A lot of trees that should have otherwise not been there.
And a development pattern that put a lot of homes into an area that has a propensity to burn.
Homes by nature have a tendency to burn, but the speed with which the fire spread is due entirely to the fuel supply.
Right. No, I can't say that, there was one reason why
There isn't
that
one
many homes
reason,
were
there's a
lost, but
million
there's
reasons.
multiple reasons, and part of it was, we were in the midst of a drought, the fuel was, at extreme, dryness, and it was explosive. But also that the fact that there were, hundreds of homes out in the fire-prone area, that the firefighters had, all of their resources protecting those homes rather than fighting the fire. And that's a reality. And so there are costs associated with, a land use pattern, a development pattern that puts a lot of people in potential harm's way. You're absolutely right that there are things that could be done to minimize the fire hazard. But a lot of that land was, there was nothing that prohibited anyone from removing trees on the property or clearing brush. People chose not to in some cases, even those cases where people did clear land. And I was out on a site where there was nothing but grass for miles around, not miles around, but for hundreds of yards. The home was still lost. It wasn't because of brush or trees up against the house. It just burned. There's no explaining it.
I'm not sure we would be able to find a one-size-fits-all. That would be my first concern. Second concern, obviously, is I know that there's dangers in people doing this, but I think that one's risky.
Well, I've already identified the legal risks that I see with all of these, and the fact that I don't think it needs to be in the general plan. If down the road the board wants to do it, that's a different issue. My problem is I don't think the plan ought to commit the board to doing it.
Maybe this is a good place to bring up a very rough idea that may or may not address Commissioner Wooster's concerns and my own, and that is that if we took some of the objectionable components and we grouped them into a single one, a program that was worded something to the effect, as needed, adopt ordinances that address concerns that arise, including but not limited to, make your list, night sky, hillside development.
How does that become a general plan?
Yeah, I think it's
Because
probably,
it tells you
I
that-
think if the intent is not to do it, I would eliminate the measure, rather than sort of this, well, maybe we'll get to it if we feel like
no
it's a good
longer an
idea.
implication
It's
if
not
it's-
really, you're not intending to do it, so don't put it in there. I think that runs more of a risk of being confusing and inconsistent with the general plan than just not having it in there. And then if it comes back as a potential mitigation measure, then we can discuss pros and cons of that and whether or not it's feasible and whether or not it's something that the county wants to do.
Okay. In that vein, then I agree with Mr. Wooster that this would be an example of, we can always do it, but we don't need to put it in the general plan, because maybe it requires a little bit more thought than what we can apply to it today. It can always be it can always be done, but it doesn't need to be in the general plan. And on top of that, I push back against the concept of the government protecting people against themselves, against what may or may not be a good idea, a bad idea, to do something. I think people should be left to their own, their own desires and abilities to the greatest extent possible, except where their actions potentially affect a bunch of other people.
Except for when you're dealing with health and safety, that statement that you just made. Not everybody has everyone has a specialty in something, and land may not be it. Geology may not be it. And at some point, health and safety does have to play a role in protecting the public. And I see that falling into that aspect. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
So maybe we should go back and just look at these one at a time then. Like lighting and glare.
Good job, yes.
So let's just can we have like a informal vote on this and see where we're at?
Make sense?
Yeah?
I don't think any of us are opposed to light and glare. I think the issue is coming up with an ordinance concerns you, correct? That's the only issue that's on the table.
Well, and personally, I think that we need one. We've been talking about one for years. I think it's important to keep people's light on their own property. It is offensive and obtrusive, and you might say, people are just going to do the right thing. Well, if people just did the right thing and they thought about lighting and glare, we wouldn't be needing to have this discussion, so.
Okay, well, let me give you an example. I mean, we all know what light does. Light travels in a straight line. Light's going to go where it goes. But, so it addresses light spillage and glare on adjacent properties. I can't turn my porch light on without it going to the neighbor's property. It's not possible.
You can have it directed, shielded downward.
I can, if I can stand on my neighbor's property and see that my porch's light is on, that light is going onto my neighbor's property, by definition.
It doesn't, and this is a challenge that I've faced with in the past with lighting ordinances. There will be people that have an expectation that when they step out their front door, they won't see any lights at all. That's unrealistic. There will be porch lights. The idea is that you don't have a spotlight. You know, so crafting the ordinance is going to address, it doesn't say it's prohibiting light spillage, it's going to address it. So a 60-watt bulb on your porch light, yeah, you can see it from across the street. But that shouldn't be considered, you know, an obnoxious, you know, nuisance, you know, in a residential neighborhood.
I've seen, deal with either direct light or.
But I've had people
So you see a little
complain,
bit of a glow because the neighbor's porch light's on. That's different than looking at the bulb.
well, even in some cases, the bulb is the light.
Yeah.
But, you know, if it's reasonable within the context of where it's located, you know, you have a commercial area, it's gonna have some brighter light, or an industrial area, you're gonna have some brighter lights, but illuminate your yard for security purposes, but don't illuminate the entire neighborhood. Those are the kind of things that you would address in the ordinance. And you come up with standards, what's acceptable, what's not. It doesn't say we're prohibiting it. It just say we're going to address these issues. So that we come up in the, you know, the crafting of the ordinance itself, you know, what kind of shielding is appropriate? Are there certain, you know, amount of lumens that might be, you know, appropriate for a certain type of use? And so that when people call and complain about their neighbor's porch light, say, you know, that's within the context of our code. You know, that's what's expected. But because I've had people call me and say, I want that porch light turned off. I can see it from my porch. And that's not what the ordinance is supposed to address. It's supposed to address someone that has a, you know, halogen lamp that goes on and shines in your bedroom window. That would be inappropriate. Or, you know, the lighting that, you know, you can look out and you can just see the glow from the amount of lighting, you know, from miles away because it's so bright. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking at here. I think, you know, that gets into the specifics of the ordinance itself. This doesn't say what's going to be in the ordinance other than we're going to address these issues. I think the question that Commissioner Wooster has brought up, though, is, you know, again, getting back to the fundamental question, do we include it at all? And I think that's where you guys need to decide yes or no.
Right. So I would say we need to include it.
You think you can do what?
I think we should include it.
Oh, yeah, I think,
You think we should include it, Ted?
yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. We've had, for all the years that I've been on this commission, we've had how many complaints of people saying, well, we don't want to see their lights. You know, that's,
So with the other commissioners? Could you weigh in on this?
Well, I've made my position pretty clear.
Okay.
It may be a good idea. I don't think it should be in the general plan.
Okay.
Where would you put it if it wasn't in the general plan? Would you put it on the agenda and tell them to do an ordinance now? Why do we have to wait? If this is such an important ordinance, why aren't we just doing it now? Why are we waiting for the general plan? That could be 2 years out.
Well, we could do it now. It's just a matter of priorities.
Good point.
How long has it been a problem?
It's been a problem forever.
Before I
Yeah.
came here, I know it's been on the list of things to do.
But never enough of a problem to warrant someone saying enough is enough, let's write an ordinance.
So I would
think
be-
that the staff resources have been directed towards, you know, coming up
This
with a general
general plan
plan and trying to
update.
process applications.
So I think waiting 2 years is silly. I say if it's that important to everybody, let's just take it out of here and push an ordinance through somehow. Let's just do it. Why wait 2 years?
Who said 2 years?
Well, by the time this goes through CEQA and EIR and comes back, it'll be 2 years
Well,
before
I-
the ordinance even gets looked at.
That could be.
So why wait 2 years?
Well, I don't
If you
think it's
want to
gonna-
remove it,
I
I
don't-
say you start writing it right now.
I don't think it's going to get pushed up in front of the
I
general
think
plan.
it would be something for Peter to write, because
Yeah.
I don't claim to be
So-
an expert on lighting.
So maybe, so are you saying in or out? let's move this along.
I'm going to say out and encourage people to start working on an ordinance now.
Okay?
What are you going to say?
I would agree that it can be out.
Okay. So that's 3-2.
That creates a real problem because we've referenced that everywhere. Do
So
we
you
need
just,
to
you
have the
have, you
implement-
just have no way of, so you're saying you've got policies that address it, and now there's no action attributed to it.
What policy?
Lots of
We just
policies
went over
through
it.
here.
410?
410?
Let me go back and look at 410.
I mean, to me, this whole implementation programs is really kind of it's an accountability and assurance to the public that, we've developed these goals, we've developed these policies, and this is how we're going to implement them. So without them, it's kind of like, well, yeah, we developed them, this is our goals, these are our policies, but, it's like, to me, it's like we have no intention.
But to me, if you put it in here, and all you're doing is saying, let's wait a couple years. You're not doing anything to get it done, except saying, let's wait a couple years. I mean,
Well, I think the reality is we're going to have to wait a couple of years anyway.
That's right.
Unless we hire additional
not
staff.
gonna
to have
happen.
So by having it in there, doesn't prevent us from doing it earlier. We could do one tomorrow if we had the resources. But is that if we don't get it done before it's adopted, then it will be one of the things on our list we intend to do.
That shows that we're serious and it is a priority.
I like lighting and glare, and I do believe we need an ordinance. I just wish there was another way to implement these things.
Well, by having it in here, it certainly has a much better chance of being implemented than if you leave it out.
Okay, and lightning and glare, okay, so here's the issue that I'm going to just go with, and this is the only thing that's swaying me right now, is that of all these things on here, nobody's complaining about any of this other stuff. Lighting and glare is the one thing that you have all said you've heard complaints on it for years, for years, for years. That's the one that is the most vocal and the loudest. And that's the one that if we leave in there and we don't ever do anything about it, we have the most risk for.
See, and I don't think there's really any risk. I'm very comfortable with the risk. We've been telling people for years that we've been going to be doing an ordinance. I mean, to me, that's a risk, too, because it has been literally years.
Well, but once you put it in the general plan, I think you increase the risk.
That
That's the
could be,
problem.
but Kelly, the reality is it should be here, and we should be doing it. So
Well-
why not put it in here?
You're saying it should be done. And
It should be done.
I agree with completely that it should be done.
Right, and if you have a whole separate list for how you're going to implement, your policies, it's like, does that make sense? It's like, oh yeah, we have all of these policies and this is what we're going to do, but if you want to know how we're going to do them and who's going to do them, you have to look at this other list over here.
Okay, this policy that it's implementing,
LU 410.
410,
I love that term, light trespass.
I really don't see what's wrong with telling people we've heard you. All of these years, we've heard you and we've promised you that, yes, we are going to address light trespass and light glare, and there are very real actions that can be taken to address light glare.
So the difference is that for all these years, we've been telling people we're going to do it, and we never have. And that's all verbal. Now you're saying it in writing. And if you don't do it, now they have got you.
But why wouldn't we do it? Does
Why
that mean that?
Okay, so but why haven't we
Well,
done it?
because we've been doing a general plan update.
No, before,
Not for 20
no.
years.
Well, we've been doing a general plan update for, aren't we getting on 10 years?
no, look, can we
So-
walk and chew gum? Yeah, or
No,
every time we do a general plan update, everything else stops? I don't think so.
Well, evidently, because it's also been a revolving door of planning directors, of consultants, of planning commissioners, of board of supervisors. We're almost like an example of if you look like how not to do a general plan update, just look at us. I mean, seriously. So the fact that we haven't done one, I don't think is a good argument. I think if we're serious about it, that's a good argument for actually putting it in here, that maybe we will do it in the next 20 years.
And if it's that important, it goes to the top of the priority list.
It's that important. So why wait? Let's do it. We don't have anything else to do, just that.
I wish.
I know, right? Okay, so yes, yes, no, no, and I'm standing here swinging you all and holding you up. I'm going to leave it in there, Fawn, and I'm going to expect you to get this done right away.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Let me suggest a one-word or couple-word change.
I would like some word changes too.
Adopt a dark sky ordinance that addresses excessive light spillage on adjacent properties and protection of the rural night sky. Adjacent properties is probably enough for a period right there.
No, I like protection of the rural night sky.
Fine,
I
fine.
think it's important.
Okay, there is no rural night sky in the middle of Valley Springs, but okay.
But there's the counties more than Valley Springs.
You're right, but this doesn't say that. It says that countywide.
Right, so maybe that wouldn't be applicable to
Right.
an urbanized area.
So
There's no
it-
rural night skies.
Well, actually, it's the urbanized areas that create
Yes.
the glow, that if you can, create the light within Valley
Yeah, yeah.
Springs, but shield it so it doesn't shine up, the people in Paloma don't see this glow, on the horizon. I think that's the point.
Okay, excessive would be included, and the word "and" glare, and light is light. Sometimes it's glaring light, and sometimes it's not glaring light, it's just light.
I'm not
If
sure what
someone
you're
could
saying.
be-
I'm okay with excessive light spillage. I mean, I'm okay with excessive.
Yeah,
The
I
addition.
just don't know the difference, I don't know how, what glare adds to it. If somebody can explain what glare adds to this.
Generally, glare refers to indirect light,
Right?
and that's normally not so much of a problem as direct light.
Either way, it's excessive light spillage, correct?
Well, some things are more important to some people than others.
I'm good with the excessive.
So I'm not going to have an issue. I like your word excessive, which is fine. And I think when the ordinance starts getting worked on, you can get out your dictionaries and go over spillage,
Yes,
glare,
and
excessive.
I would agree.
You can actually take out and make a decision on how that ordinance is going to look in 20 years.
2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
I like that.
All right, so we're good with,
Positive attitude.
we're good with excessive. Can we move on
Yes.
to hillside development?
Yes.
Okay.
Did everyone else agree?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I'm okay with it. I'm on the record as being okay with it.
Just the word excessive is all we're talking about.
Yeah, that's fine. If we're going to do it, that's fine.
Okay. Hillside development.
No.
Should we start a pool and see who wins as far as how long it'll be before this takes place?
No, Ted,
That's
all right, we're
illegal.
moving on. Let's move on.
That's
Let's not go
illegal.
back. We're on hillside development. Don't take us back there.
I know that we need one for health and safety, but I believe health and safety is going to control hillside development anyway, and I don't think you're going to ever be able to make an ordinance for hillside management that's going to be a one-size-fits-all. You can go up into the big trees where you've got some good root foundations, and then you can go into other areas where there's not, there is such a discrepancy in hillside development, it's enormous. Is there health and safety codes in place that are going to prevent somebody from building in a really bad situation?
To a degree, yes. And I don't think this is really meant to address health and safety issues so much as aesthetic and erosion.
Cut and fill, massive. So I think we have a no, one no on hillside development. I think Kelly's a no,
I'm a no.
so 3 no's. Ted?
But
Hillside,
development?
in or out?
I think it should stay in,
Me too. But we're outvoted,
so.
so I guess it's
That's the
out.
first time I ever lost.
I know. Me too.
Me too.
Landscaping,
I guess a couple of questions. One is, if state law requires water conserving design measures, why is it necessary to put in the general plan that we're going to comply with the state law? The other question is there any demonstrated need for this? And this is quite apart from my overall overriding consideration, which I've talked about already, about creating litigation risks.
I think this has to do with aesthetics as well, right?
Well, again, it implements 4.1, which is the natural scenic historic resources. 4.3, I think, yeah, 4.3.
And 4.7.
Compatibility, and 4.7, which is the other compatibility issue. So, typically, there are landscaping ordinances that require a certain minimum amount of landscaping. Is it absolutely necessary? It's a tool to help implement a variety of different desires of the community.
And really how things look.
I live in a mountain community, and I cannot stand it when someone builds a commercial building and then they make them plant things that look absolutely not natural to our neighborhood. I would rather my native plants and trees stay where they're at and not put in rocks and bark. And, I mean, I don't, it's more natural to me where I live. And when they start piling other stuff into it, it just doesn't look natural anymore. So I'm not for the landscaping. I like the natural scenic beauty.
Well, I think that the alternative is that the natural might just be pavement if there's no landscaping ordinance. It's not like putting in fake trees or trees that are non-native.
They-
It's just there's nothing. Is what
And we're
this
not
addresses.
wasting water.
Okay. So I think that's a no, or that's an out.
I'm not sure how far this landscaping ordinance would go. We can certainly, if you were to word it as not a landscaping ordinance, but a water conservation ordinance, and included in the water conservation ordinance is going to be lots of things like faucet orifices and restrictors and stuff like that probably already exists in state code. And in this water conserving ordinance, you're going to identify appropriate plants or inappropriate water-wise plants because they drink up too much water. But does this ordinance suggest that there's going to be, I don't know what's meant by minimum landscaping requirements, establishing minimum landscape requirements.
So if you have examples of minimum standards would be a certain percentage of a parking lot be landscaped, and a certain number of trees and shrubs be left existing or planted in those landscape areas. So if you've got 100 linear feet of a landscape strip, for every X number of feet, there's, one tree and 3 shrubs or something like that. Those would be the kinds of, minimum landscape standards that are
And then-
typical in a landscape ordinance.
And then where I live, they make you put in curbs to put those plants and trees in, and then the snow plows rip out the curbs, and it looks horrible.
Nice. Okay, so it's strictly for commercial, industrial, and medium to high density residential, apartment complexes, duplex developments,
Right.
and up.
Right.
I'm a no.
Well,
I think a commercial business that's opening is going to want to make their place look nice, and I think that they would do a good job of making it look nice. I mean, obviously, not everybody thinks like that, but
I I could not object to it if it was something general enough that the applicant, the industrial applicant, the commercial development, whatever, they apply their design expertise to this project
Right.
that has some kind of, let's say, space requirements. 10% of the parking area needs to be landscaped.
And
They
that,
already
that
do
may
that. They already
be,
do that.
and that may be exactly what the ordinance says. I mean,
That's
it
what
is
they
going to
already do.
provide those kinds of
They
details.
do that already, as Lisa says.
Well, some do.
Okay, so we're not talking about, we're not designing it for that, but you mentioned some design criteria, 3 bushes for every tree or something like that. I don't like that idea because they might come up with something a whole lot better, and they say, but they read an ordinance that says, for every 3 bushes, you gotta have a tree. Okay, that's kind of,
Well, you could, I mean, what you typically seen is that if you've got, there will be a minimum of 1 tree for every 20 feet of, landscape area. So there's minimum, it can't just, okay, we're just gonna put rock down.
Or a tree for every parking space or something.
Something that correlates to the, the numbers of, they can decide what kind of tree it is, unless we have, and according to state law, we're supposed to come up with an ordinance that applies what's called a water budget to the landscaping, not supposed to use more than a certain amount of water. And so what I've seen other communities do is have a list available for developers of, if you're in this area, here are the kind of plants that work well.
Yeah, I've seen the
You can
list.
choose your own, but here's ones that we've identified as being available. Not that you have to use these kind of plants. And it's going to vary from Arnold to Valley
It is
Springs.
gonna
It's gonna-
vary.
It's going to be different.
okay, now, the state law that you say you're mentioning here, what, is it applicable to all developments or just commercial, high-density residential and industrial?
Basically, it's these
It's
industrial
this
commercial.
list
Yeah,
here.
yeah, not single family, and anything that has more than, I think it's 120 or 150 square feet of landscaping. So if you just, it's so small, it's not worth the effort.
Oh, so it refers to landscaping that's already in existence?
No, if you're proposing a project
So
that
there's
has
a-
a certain amount of landscaping,
Yeah?
state law requires that it minimizes the amount of water that can be
Okay.
used. And so depending on
Any
the
chunk of
size,
landscaping greater than a certain square footage, you got to take these water-conserving measures.
right,
And what our ordinance would propose to do is overlay on that how much landscaping is required in a particular area.
right.
Well, I come back to my original point, which is, maybe this is a good idea, maybe it's not. This doesn't belong in a general plan, in my judgment. If the board down the road decides it wants to do something like this, it can do it, rather than be mandated to do it by the general plan.
So you're an out, Kelly, right?
Yes.
Yes, and Lisa is
No, because
she's out. Ted, how about you?
I'd like to see it in if we can be careful how it's worded.
Well, I think we'd have to see the ordinance, and it would come before us.
Yeah.
So are you an in or an out?
I'd say in.
All right, I'm an in. David?
One more check here. I'm checking the policies that it is supposedly addressing. Okay, it says it addresses 4.3. I don't see that it does. And number 4.7,
Those both have to do with compatibility, right?
Yeah, landscaping is one way to sort of buffer, if you're putting commercial against
Right.
residential, you create some landscaping that, so you're not just, a parking lot right up next to the house or.
Could be a hedge.
so the buffering component of that, of 4.3 is what it's addressing.
Yeah.
4.1, that's a stretch. I think a landscaping ordinance is probably a good idea. I don't think it needs to be in here.
Okay, so we've got 3 outs. Moving on, historic commercial, historic mixed-use zoning district.
Does Doesn't this raise the same wording issue that we had earlier with the word district?
Well, you could say, take out district, right?
Yeah.
And the only other thing I had here, if you wanted to say, or equivalent to recognize historic downtowns and get rid of districts, just make downtowns. And then also, it should just say community historic with the HC, right?
I don't know if
Okay.
it should say downtowns, because we have historic
Areas?
buildings out in the middle of nowhere that,
Well, this would not apply to a single historic
okay.
structure. This would be for a community
Areas.
that has a historic character within it to create,
Yeah, this is not a
I'm all
preservation.
for preserving and the downtown historic area, so you can have that on my part. There's no adoption.
So that's,
It's just to update the Calaveras County Code. I'm good.
I have no problems with 3E.
all right, Kelly? You're good, Ted? You like this one? Okay, all
okay,
right.
so I'll just correct it to, we'll get rid of the word district.
Right, and then.
Play with the language, make sure it reads properly, and then
Change.
historic community, HC,
Right.
land use designation.
Okay. Historic preservation incentives, 3F. Any issues?
Well, if there are state and federal incentive programs that are out there, why would the county need to spend money to facilitate the implementation of them?
Well, for one thing, like, for example, there's a Mills Act. I don't know a lot about it, but the county would have to adopt the Mills Act, which allows property owners of historic properties to get I think it's a reduction on their property tax?
Yes.
That kind of thing. That's what facilitate means.
So there is something can be done. that's
Yes, there
worthwhile.
exactly,
Yes.
yeah. And there could be other examples, that's just one I know of.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm fine with it.
Okay, anyone else? Everybody good? Okay, moving on, signage.
Well, this was,
That was on your list, Kelly.
that was on my list. I guess an additional question is this necessary? Is there some reason why the Calaveras County Code regarding signs needs to be updated? This has been a problem.
I don't know, it probably does need, well, I mean, I think,
It's certainly been raised as issues
Yes.
throughout the whole general plan process of communities, some community members feeling that there's, excessive signage, and we want to make sure that.
and we have a sign ordinance now.
There's a sign ordinance now, yeah.
Right, right. So this is giving it a boost in the arm, I believe.
What is
Because we
perceived-
have some really awful signage around here.
Well, but it might be pre-ordinance, and you can't do anything about it.
That-
Well, true.
that- Yeah, but it will stop perpetuating the problem.
The sign ordinance that we have in place already should have done that. It didn't do it?
I don't think it's,
Well, it's a matter of looking at the sign ordinance that we have.
Yeah.
It probably hasn't been updated in, several decades.
There's nothing wrong with updating it. It's good.
And this-
signage is very important.
What are, if you have an idea, what are some of the problems with the existing ordinance that makes it inadequate?
I don't say it's inadequate. I think there's just a desire to, by some in the community, that some of the excessive signage that we see in some places, probably the biggest complaint that I hear is, all the waving flags, all the temporary stuff that's put out there. And then off-site billboards is probably the biggest issue.
Waving flags?
Yeah, where you see, in front of, some establishment, all these temporary signs.
The banners.
The banners, that kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
Get your attention,
Right.
which can
And
also
that's
be
not
a-
addressed in the
But,
ordinance?
well,
Because I've wondered about that myself.
it's probably a little gray. The biggest problem with sign enforcement is enforcement. And when you have, 1,100 complaints on your code compliance list, and we're dealing with, life safety issues, signs always fall at the bottom of the list. But
And updating the code
wouldn't
isn't going to change
necessarily
that.
address that, but it might make it clearer so it's easier to enforce. I mean, some of the problem that we have in enforcing some of the complaints we get is that, well, the code's not really clear on this.
Oh.
Now, I can't go back and give you a specific example. I'm not that familiar with what our ordinance says on signs. But
Do you think people just aren't aware that these banners, these temporary banners strapped up in front of their place, you know, 2 for a buck?
I would say some are unaware and some would just do it anyway.
Right. So what's your pleasure on the
There's
signage?
nothing wrong with keeping it updated.
Yeah. So you're in, I'm an in, Ted's in.
You're not creating an ordinance, you're updating.
Right, you already have one.
Can I ask you how the billboard gets phased out?
There are means to amortize existing billboards. So in this, signage is a very, very complex technical legal aspect of land use law. It's wrapped into free speech issues, and the sign lobby is very strong. And so there's been certain language that's been written into state law that other land uses don't get the advantage of. For example, if an illegal sign is installed and the owner is not notified within 5 years of the fact that that sign is illegal, it becomes legal regardless. It's written into state law. And there are very strict controls as to what you can regulate versus what, what's on the sign. We can't tell anyone what they can put on a sign. So part of our problem with our code is that it's probably inconsistent with a lot of state and case law. It's just a matter of making sure that if we choose through an ordinance to remove certain signage, there are provisions for amortization of a sign. So say over a period of a certain